The auditorium buzzed with excitement, a sea of proud families capturing every smile, every handshake, every moment of triumph as young cadets marched across the stage. Yet, tucked away in the back corner, sat a man so unassuming that most didn't even notice him. His silver hair caught the light just enough to reveal the quiet dignity etched into his face. Hands folded calmly in his lap, his gaze was distant, not lost, but deeply anchored in memories only he could see. No one in the crowd knew who he was, and no one asked. To the thousands gathered, he was invisible, just another elderly attendee blending into the background of this day of celebration. But as the ceremony unfolded, something unexpected happened. A three-star general, standing tall in his polished uniform, broke protocol. Without hesitation, he walked across the room, his steps purposeful and deliberate, and stopped right in front of the quiet man. The auditorium fell silent. The general's hand rose in a sharp, respectful salute, a gesture that echoed louder than any applause. In that moment, the stories untold and sacrifices unseen came rushing into the light. The man wasn't just a spectator. He was a hero whose quiet courage had shaped the very future this ceremony celebrated. What followed left 2,000 people speechless, a poignant reminder that true heroes often don't seek the spotlight. Their valor lies in the lives they've touched and the quiet strength they carry, invisible, yet indelible. Welcome to the Veteran Voices. Before we continue with this incredible story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, please hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being part of this community. The United States Military Academy at West Point had seen many graduation ceremonies, but May 15th started like any other. The massive auditorium buzzed with the energy of families who had traveled from across the country to watch their sons and daughters receive their commissions as second lieutenants. Cameras flashed constantly. Proud parents adjusted their positions for better views. Siblings complained about the heat, while grandparents dabbed tears from their eyes before the ceremony even began. In the sea of celebration, Section K offered a different atmosphere. Here, the crowd was thinner, the conversations quieter. These were the overflow seats, the last-minute additions, the spots reserved for distant relatives and family friends who hadn't planned far enough ahead. Most people avoided this section if they could help it. The view wasn't great, the lighting was dim, and you had to strain to see the stage clearly. That's exactly where Frank Williams chose to sit. He arrived early, before the parking lots filled up, before the crowds gathered. He wore a simple gray suit that looked like it had been purchased decades ago, but maintained with careful attention. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, his tie knotted with military precision, his hair combed back in the same style he'd worn for 60 years. Everything about him suggested discipline, but nothing about him suggested importance. The security guard at the entrance had barely looked at his ticket. The ushers pointed him toward Section K without a second glance. Other attendees squeezed past him in the narrow row without acknowledging his presence. To everyone who saw him, if they saw him at all, Frank Williams was exactly what he appeared to be, a quiet old man who probably had some distant connection to one of the graduating cadets. They had no idea they were sitting near a legend. As the auditorium filled, Frank remained motionless. He didn't check his phone because he didn't carry one. He didn't make small talk with the people around him because no one tried to start a conversation. He simply waited, hands resting on his knees, breathing steadily, watching the stage with the focused attention of someone who understood the significance of what was about to happen. The ceremony began with military precision. The West Point Band played as 1,200 cadets marched in perfect formation, their movements synchronized like a single organism. The crowd rose to their feet, applauding and cheering. Frank stood too, but his applause was different, measured, respectful, the clapping of someone who understood what these young men and women were really committing to. The superintendent delivered his remarks about duty, honor, and country. A distinguished guest spoke about leadership in an uncertain world. Each speech was met with appropriate applause, but Frank noticed things others missed. He saw the slight tremor in one cadet's hands during the oath. He observed the way another kept glancing toward his family, as if memorizing their faces. He recognized the mixture of pride and fear that every new officer carried on their first day. Because Frank Williams had seen it all before. Many times, as the ceremony progressed, the crowd began to settle into the rhythm of military formality. Parents pulled out their phones to record their children receiving their commissions. Families whispered about dinner plans and travel arrangements. The initial excitement gave way to the comfortable routine of watching a long ceremony unfold. But on the stage, Lieutenant General Patricia Hayes was having a different experience entirely. General Hayes had been scanning the crowd periodically throughout the ceremony, a habit developed from years of public appearances. She liked to connect with the families, to see the faces of the people who had supported these new officers through 4 difficult years at West Point. Her eyes moved systematically across the auditorium, section by section, acknowledging the sacrifice and commitment that filled every seat. When her gaze reached Section K, she almost moved on without pausing. The lighting was poor, and most of the faces were difficult to distinguish. But something made her look again. In the back corner, sitting perfectly straight despite his age, was a man whose posture she recognized even from a distance. General Hayes felt her breath catch. She looked again, more carefully this time, trying to confirm what her instincts were telling her. The profile, the way he held his shoulders, the disciplined stillness, everything matched her memory. But it seemed impossible. The man she was thinking of would be in his 80s now. He wouldn't be sitting in the overflow section. He would have been given a place of honor, an escort, recognition. Unless he had specifically chosen not to be recognized. The realization hit her like a physical blow. General Hayes had been in the middle of presenting a commendation when she spotted him, and now she found herself struggling to remember her next words. The cadet standing before her waited patiently, but the general's attention was completely focused on the man in Section K. She knew that face. She had stared at it for months during the most challenging period of her military career. 35 years ago, when she was a brand new second lieutenant terrified of making a mistake that could cost lives, that man had been her anchor. He had taught her everything that mattered. He had shown her what real leadership looked like. He had saved her career, her confidence, and quite possibly her life. Master Sergeant Frank Williams, Medal of Honor recipient, the most decorated non-commissioned officer of his generation, the man who had trained more successful officers than anyone in modern military history, the legend who had disappeared from public life 20 years ago and never sought recognition for anything he had accomplished. And he was sitting in the back corner like he didn't matter. General Hayes completed the presentation she had been making, but her movements were now automatic. Her mind was entirely focused on the decision she was about to make. She could finish the ceremony as planned, then seek out Sergeant Williams afterward for a private conversation. That would be the safe choice, the expected choice, the choice that wouldn't disrupt the careful choreography of a formal military ceremony. Or she could do what Frank Williams had taught her to do 35 years ago, recognize what was truly important and act on it, regardless of protocol. The next cadet stepped forward to receive his commission. General Hayes looked down at him, then back toward Section K, then at the microphone in front of her. The entire auditorium was focused on the stage, waiting for her to continue with the ceremony. 1,200 cadets stood at attention. 2,000 family members watched expectantly. General Hayes made her choice. She stepped back from the podium and spoke into her microphone, her voice carrying clearly throughout the auditorium. "Ladies and gentlemen, please hold for a moment." The crowd murmured softly, confused by the unexpected interruption. The cadets remained at attention, trained to wait for orders. General Hayes walked to the edge of the stage and looked directly towards Section K. "I need to ask your indulgence for just a moment," she continued, her voice now carrying a different tone, not the formal cadence of a ceremony, but the genuine emotion of someone about to correct an oversight. "There is someone in our audience today who should not be sitting in the back of this auditorium." The murmuring grew louder. People began turning in their seats, trying to figure out what was happening. In Section K, Frank Williams sat completely still, but his eyes had found General Hayes on the stage. Their gazes met across the crowded auditorium, and in that moment, both of them knew exactly what was about to happen. "Master Sergeant Frank Williams," General Hayes said, her voice now carrying to every corner of the room. "Would you please stand?" The auditorium fell completely silent. 2,000 people turned to look toward Section K, searching for the man the general had named. Frank Williams sat motionless for a long moment, clearly wishing he could disappear entirely. But when a three-star general calls your name in front of 1,200 cadets, you respond. Slowly, Frank Williams rose to his feet. General Hayes stepped down from the stage. She walked across the front of the auditorium, past the rows of cadets standing at attention, past the distinguished guests and academy officials, directly toward Section K. Her steps echoed in the silence. Every person in the auditorium watched as she made her way toward the back corner where Frank Williams stood waiting. When she reached his row, General Hayes didn't hesitate. She stepped into the narrow space between the seats, navigating past other attendees who pressed back to make room, until she stood directly in front of Frank Williams. Then, in front of 2,000 people, Lieutenant General Patricia Hayes came to attention and rendered a perfect military salute to the elderly man in the gray suit. "Master Sergeant Williams," she said, her voice breaking slightly with emotion. "It is an honor to serve in the same military that you have defended with such distinction." Frank Williams returned the salute with the crisp precision of a man who had performed the gesture thousands of times. But his hand trembled slightly as he lowered it, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. General Hayes turned to address the crowd, her voice now carrying across the silent auditorium without need for a microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, cadets, families, and distinguished guests, you are in the presence of Master Sergeant Frank Williams, Medal of Honor recipient. This man trained me when I was a terrified second lieutenant who didn't know the first thing about leadership. He taught half the officers in this room, and many of the officers who taught the other half." She paused, looking back at Frank Williams, then continued. "Sergeant Williams served 3 tours in Vietnam, where he earned the Medal of Honor for actions that saved the lives of his entire platoon. But more than that, he spent 30 years training officers, teaching them not just how to follow orders, but how to make the kinds of decisions that bring soldiers home alive. He never sought recognition. He never asked for special treatment. He came here today to honor these new officers, just as he has honored this military his entire life." The silence in the auditorium was absolute. General Hayes turned back to Frank Williams. "Master Sergeant, with your permission, I would like these cadets to understand what real service looks like." Frank Williams nodded once, a small gesture that somehow conveyed both humility and dignity. General Hayes raised her voice to address the entire auditorium. "Master Sergeant Williams was awarded the Medal of Honor on November 12, 1969, for actions during a firefight in the Mekong Delta. His unit was pinned down by enemy fire. 7 soldiers were wounded and couldn't be evacuated. The enemy was closing in, and air support was still 20 minutes away." She paused, looking toward the cadets who hung on every word. Master Sergeant Williams made a decision. He left his covered position and walked directly into enemy fire to draw their attention away from the wounded soldiers. He held that position alone for 18 minutes, under constant attack, until helicopter support arrived. He saved 7 lives that day. The general's voice grew stronger. "But that's not why he's a legend. He's a legend because for the next 30 years, he took young officers like me, officers like many of your instructors, and taught us what courage actually means. Not the kind of courage that shows off, but the kind that shows up. Every day, without recognition, without applause, because it's the right thing to do." General Hayes stepped back and addressed the entire cadet corps. "Cadets, you will face moments in your careers when you have to choose between what's easy and what's right. When those moments come, remember Master Sergeant Williams. Remember that true leadership isn't about getting credit. It's about taking responsibility. It's about serving something bigger than yourself, even when no one is watching." She turned back to Frank Williams and saluted him again. "Master Sergeant, these cadets are about to receive their commissions as officers in the United States Army. They will swear an oath to support and defend the Constitution. But more than that, they will carry forward the example you have set. The example of service without recognition, leadership without ego, courage without fanfare." General Hayes stepped back and addressed the entire auditorium. "Master Sergeant Williams, would you please come forward and assist me in commissioning these new officers?" Frank Williams shook his head slightly, a gesture that was both grateful and declining. He wasn't seeking recognition, and he wasn't comfortable being the center of attention. But General Hayes had expected this response. "Master Sergeant, that wasn't a request." The slightest smile crossed Frank Williams' face. He recognized the tone of voice. It was the same tone he had used with countless young officers over the years. The tone that said, "This is bigger than your personal comfort. This is about something that matters." Frank Williams nodded once and began making his way out of his row. The journey from Section K to the stage took several minutes. Frank Williams moved slowly, partly because of his age, but mostly because every person he passed stood to shake his hand or simply touch his shoulder. Cadets broke their formation to salute him as he passed. Parents who had never heard his name before today found themselves moved to tears by the simple dignity of his presence. When he finally reached the stage, General Hayes was waiting with a microphone. "Master Sergeant Williams, would you like to say anything to these new officers?" Frank Williams took the microphone, looked out at the 1,200 cadets standing at attention, and spoke in a voice that was quiet but carried clearly throughout the auditorium. "I came here today to watch you begin your careers as officers. I didn't come to be recognized or honored. I came because I believe in what you're about to become." He paused, looking across the sea of young faces. "You will face challenges I can't imagine. You will make decisions that will affect the lives of the soldiers you lead. When those moments come, remember this: leadership isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about caring more about your soldiers than you care about yourself." He handed the microphone back to General Hayes, but she gestured for him to continue. "The Medal of Honor isn't something you earn for yourself. It's something you earn for the people who couldn't be there to earn it themselves. Every day you wear that uniform, you represent something bigger than your own ambitions. Don't ever forget that." Frank Williams stepped back, but General Hayes wasn't finished. "Master Sergeant Williams, by the authority vested in me as Superintendent of the United States Military Academy, I would like to present you with the position of Honorary Reviewing Officer for today's ceremony." She gestured toward a chair that had been quickly brought to the center of the stage. These cadets should receive their commissions in the presence of the kind of officer they aspire to become. Frank Williams sat down in the place of honor, and for the next hour, every new officer in the United States Army received their commission while saluting a man who had spent his entire life preparing them for the responsibility they were accepting. The ceremony concluded with the traditional hat toss, but before the cadets threw their covers into the air, they turned as one toward Frank Williams and rendered a final salute. The sound of 1,200 hands moving in unison echoed through the auditorium like thunder. When the celebration began, Frank Williams quietly stood and began walking toward the exit. He had done what he came to do. He had honored the new officers, and they had honored him in return. As far as he was concerned, that was enough. But General Hayes intercepted him before he could leave. "Master Sergeant, where are you going?" "Home, ma'am. The ceremony is over." "The ceremony is over, but this isn't." She gestured toward the crowd of cadets, families, and officers who were all trying to get closer to Frank Williams. "These people want to meet you. They want to thank you." Frank Williams looked uncomfortable. "General, I appreciate what you did today, but I didn't come here for thanks." "I know you didn't. That's exactly why you deserve them." For the next 2 hours, Frank Williams stood in the reception area and met with cadets, families, and officers. He didn't tell war stories or give speeches. Mostly, he listened. He listened to young officers talk about their fears and hopes. He listened to parents express their pride and worry. He listened to senior officers share memories of lessons he had taught them decades earlier. Each conversation was brief, but each person walked away with something they hadn't expected to find: a connection to the history and honor of military service that went beyond ribbons and ceremonies. As the afternoon wound down, General Hayes found Frank Williams sitting quietly on a bench outside the auditorium, watching the last families load into their cars for the drive home. "Master Sergeant, can I ask you something?" "Of course, ma'am. Why did you sit in Section K? I could have arranged for you to have a place of honor. You could have been recognized from the beginning." Frank Williams was quiet for a long moment. "General, I've been to a lot of ceremonies over the years. I've seen what happens when the focus shifts from the people being honored to the people doing the honoring. Today wasn't about me. It was about those cadets beginning their service." He looked toward the parking lot where the last cars were pulling away. "Besides, recognition is something that should come from what you do, not from where you sit. Those young officers will face situations where no one is watching, where no one will applaud, where the only thing that matters is doing the right thing because it's the right thing. That's the kind of recognition that matters." General Hayes sat down next to him on the bench. Master Sergeant, you taught me something important today. What's that, ma'am? You taught me that sometimes the most important thing a leader can do is recognize someone else's service. I almost let you sit in that back corner unnoticed. I almost let this ceremony end without acknowledging what you've contributed to every person in that room. She stood up and extended her hand. Thank you for letting me correct that mistake. Frank Williams shook her hand and smiled. Thank you for remembering what matters, General. As General Hayes walked back toward the auditorium, Frank Williams remained on the bench for a few more minutes. The parking lot was nearly empty now. The ceremony was over. The celebration had ended. In a few hours, the new officers would begin their journeys to their first assignments, carrying with them the lessons they had learned at West Point and the example they had witnessed today. Frank Williams stood up, straightened his tie, and walked toward his car. He moved with the same measured pace he had maintained all day, the same disciplined stride that had carried him through decades of service. To anyone watching, he looked exactly like what he was, a quiet old man heading home after attending a graduation ceremony. But now, 1,200 new officers knew better. They had seen what real service looked like. They had witnessed the kind of leadership that doesn't demand recognition but earns respect through decades of putting others first. They had met a legend who wore his honor so lightly that he almost disappeared into the crowd. Almost, but not quite. Because there are moments when hiding is impossible, when service demands to be acknowledged, when the right person in the right place makes the right choice to ensure that heroism doesn't go unnoticed. Frank Williams drove home that evening the same way he had arrived, quietly, without fanfare, without any expectation of thanks or recognition. But behind him, he left 1,200 new officers who would carry his example with them for the rest of their careers. Officers who had learned that true leadership isn't about standing in front of crowds or receiving applause. It's about sitting in Section K and showing up anyway. It's about training young leaders without taking credit for their success. It's about earning the Medal of Honor and then spending the rest of your life living up to it in ways that no one sees. It's about being the kind of person who, when a 3-star general stops a ceremony to salute you, accepts the recognition with grace while remembering that the moment isn't really about you at all. Sometimes heroes wear uniforms and march in parades. Sometimes they give speeches and receive awards. But sometimes they sit in the back corner, wearing an old gray suit, waiting patiently for their chance to honor someone else's achievement. Frank Williams understood something that the world often forgets. The greatest honor isn't in being recognized, but in being worthy of recognition when it comes. And on May 15th, in front of 2,000 people who almost overlooked him entirely, Master Sergeant Frank Williams reminded everyone what that kind of honor looks like. This story was brought to you by the Veteran Voices. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Someone who served quietly, led by example, and made a difference without seeking applause. Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how they changed your life. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We'll see you in the next one.